this game. Get out. 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 What part of blood do you understand? I just had surgery on my knee. I just had surgery on my knee, bro. Back up. Hey, go. Call through.
I guess the police officer was put on administrative leave. Were you aware of that? And
Nah. I wasn't. That should tell you everything you need to know then.
If you thought the marquee matchup in Week 1 of the NFL was the Chiefs versus the Ravens, think again. It actually turned out to be Miami Dolphins star receiver Tyreek Hill versus the Miami-Dade police. That's because 3 hours before kickoff in Miami, several officers pulled over Hill for allegedly speeding. Hill was driving a McLaren 720S. But after Hill gave them his driver's license, the officers dragged Hill out of his car, slammed him to the ground with a knee to his back, handcuffed him, tackled him again, this time by the neck and chest, and then kept Hill in handcuffs while they sorted things out. Remarkably, Hill then caught 7 passes for 130 yards, including an 80-yard touchdown catch during his team's 20-17 win over the Jacksonville Jaguars. He did the ultimate celebration by putting his hands behind his back as if he was handcuffed. But most importantly, Hill, my #1 fantasy draft choice, led my team to victory in Week 1. Thank God. But despite having body cams, the videos of which have now been released, the police immediately started lying about what happened. They said he became uncooperative and failed to show his ID, but we're going to examine the tape frame by frame, and you can decide who's telling the truth. Now, at the beginning of this body cam footage, you can see various cars drive by, and then Hill drives by in his McLaren 720S, clearly going faster than the previous cars. At first, this looks like an ordinary traffic stop, except that right from the beginning, there are at least 4 motorcycle police behind the car, which might have played a part in the escalation. We'll talk about that later. The officer asks for Hill's license, and Hill puts his window down and hands it over. At this point, Hill is clearly in a hurry and says something like he's late for practice.
Why don't you have your seatbelt on? Why don't you have your seatbelt on? Like what? Why do you have it up? It's Tyreek. At least I know where you're talking to. My TV, bro, so I can go. What you gotta do? Put it down. Hey!
And obviously here, Hill is not as respectful, or some would say obsequious, as he could be towards the police officer. And some have argued that his bad attitude escalated the situation, and that might be true in a conventional sense, but as we'll talk about later, probably not in a legally important sense. But then Hill puts his window back up. We later find out that this is when he called his agent. The officer realizes that Hill has put his window up, and he taps on the window again and asks him to put the window down, and Hill does in fact lower the window a crack. The cop then, I would argue, freaks out.
Hey! Keep your window down. Keep your window down, I'm gonna get you out of the car. As a matter of fact, get out of the car. Give me your ass, Get out of the car. Give me your ass, we'll break that freaking window. Get out of the car. Get out of the car right now. We're not playing this game. Get out. 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 What part of blood don't you understand?
And as you can see, he doesn't give Hill any time to put the window down, and only a few seconds elapse between the time that he asked him to put the window down further and the time that he's dragged out. And in all this, it appears the officers are giving contradictory instructions. At this point, Hill is detained and not resisting at all. We'll talk about the legality of this arrest, and it is an arrest. He just wasn't formally booked or indicted. But then we have him on the ground within just 7 seconds. Hill was apparently on the phone with his agent, Drew Rosenhaus, and he said, "Drew, I'm getting arrested."
Hey, Drew, I'm getting arrested, Drew. I'm getting arrested.
In the next segment, the officers handcuffed Hill, and there are 4 officers in the frame. You can see here that he's not resisting, but one of the officers has his hand pressing on the back of Hill's neck and a knee on his lower back. He then puts his knee on top of Hill's hand as he puts the handcuffs on. And here the officer says, when we tell you to do something, you do it, understand?
When we tell you to do something, you do it. You understand? I'm getting up.
But it's not clear what order Hill didn't comply with. Probably not lowering the window, but it's also not clear he had time to comply. And of course, he did lower the window a few inches, and the officer's command could be ambiguous as to whether he wanted it lowered more or just a crack. Hill says he was getting out, but the officers said it was too late.
You understand? I'm getting out. You understand? Not what you want, but what we tell you. You're a little confused.
I'm getting out, bro.
Too late.
Chill,
Too late.
All right, bro, take me to jail, bro. Do what you gotta do, bro.
We are. We will.
Good, bro.
It is good.
Hey, Drew, hey.
Don't worry about it. I hung up the phone. Stop crying.
Bruh.
And as you heard, Hill says, "Take me to jail," and the cop says he will. The officer hangs up on Rosenhaus and warns Hill to stop crying. And once the officers get Hill to his feet, he has something to say.
Yo, bro, dude, beating on my window like he crazy. I ain't do nothing, twin. Dang.
Now, Hill has a right to say whatever he wants, but the officers clearly don't like it. But he doesn't appear to be resisting, and he's cuffed, and he seems to be fully compliant. Now then later, the officer has his hand on Hill's shoulder, and I think the officer indicates that he wants Hill to sit on the curb, but all we hear is Hill saying, "Hold on, bro." The other officer springs into action, grabbing Hill around the neck, and let's see what happens.
Hold on, twin, hold on. Hold on, just had surgery on my knee. I just had surgery on my knee, bro.
And so they drag him to the ground. Hill says, hold on, bro, again. And he yells, I just had surgery on my knee. But you can see here that Hill does start to bend his knees. And to me, this is the worst part because again, this is my #1 fantasy draft choice. But the cop cutely responds by asking if he had surgery on his ears.
Really? What a coincidence. I just had surgery in your ears when we told you to put your window down.
Bro.
But then his teammate Jonu Smith arrives at the scene and the cop starts running towards him as if he's a threat. And during this part of the arrest, you can see Hill sitting on the ground handcuffed. Now, finally, the officer explains to Smith exactly what went wrong.
Well, what's up? What's the reason for this?
Orders, man. We're trying to talk to him to the window, get his ID. He doesn't put his window down. You gotta identify yourself when you get stopped.
Man, this is crazy.
He's driving reckless since the turnpike back there, and we pulled him over here. If he knows he's coming here, he knows all the traffic, all the pedestrians, you can't drive like that, man. You can't.
Now, it seems like what the officer said is not correct. Hill did put his window down and handed him his ID. And here's that part of the video again. So at no point did Hill fail to identify himself. The officer just got angry when Hill put his window back up. So there's further conversation between Smith and the officer. There's also a random Dolphin fan walking by who does a double take. Because yeah, it's surprising that Tyreek Hill is being arrested here. Smith says that what happened to his teammate is ridiculous. The officer gives his side of the story.
He's driving reckless since back behind the turnpike.
Man, all of this is uncalled for, man. All
All he had to do.
Why is he getting arrested? Why is he getting arrested?
What's your name?
Janu, why is he getting
John.
arrested though?
If we stop you and you don't identify yourself to the police, we have to get you out of the car. And that's what happens.
Hell?
Now, at this point, Hill is getting agitated. This is a traffic stop, and they haven't told him why he was under arrest. He's trying to get to work, and a supervising cop asks what happens.
No, so look, he told me to pull over, right? And I pulled over, he was like, why ain't your seatbelt on? I'm like, sir, was I speeding? He was like, nah. He was like, yeah, you were speeding. I'm like, sir, I was going 55 in a 40. Okay, that's cool. I was like, okay, write me a ticket. Write me a ticket so I can go. He was like, so like he started walking away. I let my window back up and I put my seatbelt on, right? So he was like, oh, put your window. I said, I'm not gonna put my window down, bro. I'm not, bro. I'm gonna call Drew. So I called Drew. You know Drew Brooks, right? So I called Drew to make sure everything was straight. He started getting hostile. He's like, get out the car, get out the car. I said, bro, for what? Let me call Drew first. Give me 1 second, sir. I never once got out of control or nothing. But then they pulled me out the car, slammed me on my knee, and he fucked my knee up again, dog. I got tendonitis again, bro.
At that point, more Dolphins players arrive at the scene to find out what's going on. Calais Campbell, the 2019 Walter Payton NFL Man of the Year award winner, said he intended to de-escalate the situation. And as you can see here, they tell him to get in his car and leave, and when he starts to walk away, they follow and handcuff him. And obviously the officers here did not charge Calais with any crime. And about that supervising officer, it's only when he shows up about 18 minutes later that anyone thinks to actually write the ticket to Hill. So let's talk about whether this was a legal traffic stop and arrest. To initiate a traffic stop, a police officer must have what's called reasonable suspicion that a driver or passenger is involved in a criminal activity or poses a danger. The officers in Hill's case allegedly had reasonable suspicion that Hill was going about 60 miles an hour in a 45-mile-an-hour zone. They also claimed he was not wearing his seatbelt, so they pulled him over and asked for his license and registration. Now, you might have noticed that Hill's window tinting is pretty dark, so color me skeptical that they were able to see he wasn't wearing his seatbelt. Though, at the same time, if you're the Miami Dolphins, you might want your players to get insurance if they get injured in a car crash and they're not wearing their seatbelts. But if you're an NFL star who's been injured in a car crash, whether you were wearing a seatbelt or not, you'll want a great lawyer. And my law firm, the Eagle Team, can help. If you've suffered a data breach, especially if you got one of those data breach letters saying your information might have been leaked, are dealing with sexual harassment, or were involved in a car crash in your McLaren 720S, we can represent you or help find you the right attorney who can. Because it's so important to talk to a lawyer right away so you can get the best representation, maximize your recovery, and find out what your options are. So just click on the link in the description or call the phone number on screen for a free consultation with my team. Because you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle Team. So you can click below. But in Florida, you must provide identification that you were driving a car that the police have pulled over. Here, I think it's reasonable that the officers had reasonable suspicion that Hill was speeding, so they had enough to pull him over. But by that same token, Hill complied with the requirement to provide his ID, even though the officers later claimed that he did not. But why did the officers escalate the situation instead of writing Hill a ticket, and were they legally able to do so? Well, when the story broke, the police tried to make Hill's identity the sticking point. A police spokesperson told a radio station that, quote, the union has not been able to view body camera footage, and the officers didn't know know who they'd pulled over Sunday morning. Now, I don't see how that can possibly be true, given that the body cam videos show him producing ID, and also he's a person who might be very recognizable to police. Now, I know these cops might not be the brightest bunch, but given that they're camped outside of a football stadium on game day, and they pulled over a $350,000 sports car with other luxury cars like a tricked-out Rolls-Royce right nearby, long before the game has started, maybe they should have suspected that they were pulling over one of the football players. I don't know. On the other hand, police might claim the window tinting was too dark for them to see what was going on inside the vehicle. And I'm sure there will be claims that the window must be down for the safety of the officers, though we will definitely talk about that in a second. Now, the laws regarding window tinting on vehicles are outlined in Florida statutes 316.2951 through 56. Now, these laws regulate how dark and reflective your vehicle's window tint can be, with different standards for sedans, SUVs, and vans. And for front side windows, the tinting must allow more than 28% of light to pass through. But the police didn't mention the windows or cite him for a moving violation, which is permissible under Florida law. So I think they'd have a hard time proving that the windows were impermissibly dark. But Hill complied with his legal obligations during the stop. He's a celebrity, and thus maybe he doesn't want photos or videos of this altercation, so raising his window made sense, especially since he's under no obligation to answer any further questions with the police. But this clearly pisses off the police officers, who tell him to lower his window, which he does, but he lowers it only a few inches. But then the officer change their minds and demand that it's not enough, and they pull him out of the car. But was it legal for the officers to demand Hill put his window down and then drag him out of the car? Well, in a 1977 case called Pennsylvania versus Mims, the Supreme Court ruled that a police officer can order a driver to exit their vehicle during a mere traffic stop without violating the Fourth Amendment. But really not much more than that. The case arose when Harry Mims was pulled over by police for an expired license plate. After being ordered out of the car, the officers noted a bulge in his jacket, searched him, and found a loaded gun. Mims argued that ordering him out of the car was a violation of his Fourth Amendment rights. Now, the court said that the officer's safety is an important purpose, and it outweighed Mims' privacy concerns. And if a stop occurs on a busy highway, asking the person to exit the car and move to the side of the road could protect him and the officers from ongoing traffic. But anything more than a de minimis relocation or imposition has to be related to the purpose of the original stop. And obviously, Hill's case is different than the Mims case because they were not on a busy highway and there was almost no traffic. He was also surrounded by police. The officers did not voice safety concerns when Hill put his window up. And it's also important to note that safety concerns don't give officers the right to do whatever they want. That's why in a 1998 case called Knowles versus Iowa, the Supreme Court put limits on what police can do during a routine traffic stop, saying that safety concerns arising out of a potential traffic citation are a good deal less than in the case of a custodial arrest. In that case, an Iowa officer pulled Patrick Knowles over for speeding. The officer issued a citation, but then conducted a full search of Knowles' car without any further justification. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled that a search incident to an arrest is only justified when there's an actual custodial arrest, and it serves two primary purposes: protecting officer safety and preventing evidence destruction. The court also cautioned that, quote, the need to discover and preserve evidence does not exist in a traffic stop. For once Knowles was stopped for speeding and issued a citation, all evidence necessary to prosecute that offense had been obtained. So again, Hill had already identified himself, giving everything they needed to investigate his vehicle and write him a ticket. In 2015, the Supreme Court decided Rodriguez versus United States, which addressed what specific activities police can undertake during a traffic stop. In that case, an officer pulled over Denny Rodriguez for driving on the highway shoulder. After completing routine tasks associated with the stop, including checking Rodriguez's license and issuing a warning, the officer asked if he could walk a drug-sniffing dog around the car. Rodriguez refused, and the officer detained him for an additional 7 to 8 minutes until another officer arrived and then conducted the dog sniff test. But the Supreme Court said that the stop's legitimate mission has two components: one, addressing the traffic violation, and two, attending to related safety concerns. Now, what are those related safety concerns? Quote, checking the driver's license, determining whether there are outstanding warrants against the driver, and inspecting the automobile's registration and proof. These checks are part of the stop's mission because they serve the same objective as enforcement of the traffic code, ensuring that vehicles on the road are operated safely and responsibly. Now, it doesn't appear that Hill did anything to impede the officer's ability to perform those core tasks. The officer had Hill's driver's license in his hand. They knew or should have known that they were dealing with football player Tyreek Hill, who was on his way to the stadium, which you can even see in the background of the body cam videos. The officer could have checked for warrants, verified Hill's insurance, and confirmed the vehicle's registration without Hill's window being all the way down. So there doesn't appear to be any reason for Hill to be outside of the car, let alone handcuffed and sitting on the side of the road. And a 2022 Florida case called Baxter versus Roberts suggests that demanding Hill to get out of the car would be unconstitutional. In that case, an 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is binding on Florida, outlined what activities are not part of a traffic stop's legitimate mission. Quote, authority for the seizure thus ends when the tasks tied to the traffic infraction are, or reasonably should have been, completed. Unrelated detours that extend the stop beyond that point violate the Fourth Amendment. So I suspect Hill can probably argue that everything that happened after he gave the officer his ID was an unrelated detour beyond the scope of the initial stop. To me, it looks like they were punishing Hill because they didn't like his attitude. And maybe you didn't like the way that he was speaking to the police at the beginning of the stop, and maybe you would have been more respectful to a police officer who pulls you over. That's totally fine, and that is a valid opinion to have, but I don't see how that's constitutionally relevant here. So just how long were the officers allowed to detain Hill? Well, instead of writing him a ticket and releasing him, they forced him to the ground and handcuffed him and set him on the side of the road, and then forced him to the ground again. And Florida statute section 901.501 says, quote, "No person shall be temporarily detained under the provisions of subsection 2 longer than is reasonably necessary to effect the purposes of that subsection. Such temporary detention shall not extend beyond the place where it was first effected or the immediate vicinity thereof." So there's no specific time limit that police can keep a person detained on a traffic stop. Generally, once the officer writes you a ticket, you're free to go. But in Hill's case, it's really clear that they took their time writing the ticket. It actually looks like 18 minutes. Once Hill provided his ID and registration, he had a right to remain silent throughout the rest of the detainment. And as we discussed, the police can keep you for as long as it takes to investigate the reason for pulling you over. And here, the time seems extremely excessive. It wasn't until the supervisor showed up 18 minutes later that the police even began to write the ticket. So my feeling is that Hill was legally allowed to roll up his window, and doing so did not give the police probable cause to arrest him. Pulling someone over for a traffic infraction is different than pulling someone over for a suspected bank robbery. The investigation of a car and the concerns of officer safety have to be tied to the purpose of the traffic stop, and they don't appear to have any suspicion beyond the fact that he might have been speeding. And other than providing ID, registration, and insurance, Hill was not required to answer any questions of the police. Remember that whole right to remain silent in the Fifth Amendment thing? And you'd think that with half a dozen police officers, it would have been pretty easy to get this done. What's more likely is that the cop was on a power trip and wanted to show off in front of his friends, which, last time I checked, yep, not a defense. Now, Hill was cited for reckless driving, which is defined as, quote, "Any person operating a vehicle upon the streets or highways within the state shall drive the same in a careful and prudent manner, having regard for the width, grade, curves, corners, traffic, and all other attendant circumstances, so as not to endanger the life, limb, or property of any person. Failure to drive in such manner shall constitute careless driving and a violation of this section." His citation says he was driving at a visual estimation of 60 miles an hour in a 40-mile-per-hour zone with no seatbelt, and meanwhile, the Miami-Dade Police Department is investigating the incident. Officer Danny Torres has been placed on administrative duties while the internal affairs investigation continues. So presumably Torres was the one that pulled him out of the car, though Officer M. Batista signed the citation, therefore I assume he's the one that initially pulled Hill over. Now, after the Dolphins game, Hill reasonably questioned what would have happened if he was not Super Bowl champion Tyreek Hill.
What if I wasn't Tyreek Hill? Lord knows, like, what that guy or guys would have did, you feel me?
Hill and his lawyers are pursuing a legal remedy. But the event has been divisive between those that support the police and those that support Hill. What's interesting is that Tyreek Hill's arrest has been covered extensively by over 300 news outlets. 29% of the reporting is coming from the left, and only 13% is coming from the right. But if you compare the headlines, you'll start to see some interesting framing emerge. On the center left, you can see outlets putting the detail that the officer involved has been put on administrative leave right up front. And on the right, you see an outlet focusing on what the police union said happened. And depending on which article you see first, your view of the story can be completely different. If you read left-leaning sources, you might be up in arms about the injustice done by the police, as with this ABC headline. And if you lean right, you might think the whole deal is overblown and Hill should have complied faster, whether that assessment is true or not. Now, this is all possible thanks to today's sponsor, Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to deliver readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. Ground News gathers related articles from around the world and across the political spectrum, so you can see the bias and compare coverage. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For all the stories on police injustices, not only can you see the coverage details and political bias, but you can also see the factuality and ownership information the source is reporting. One of my favorite parts is their bias comparison feature, which highlights specific differences in reporting across the political spectrum. This can be especially helpful when reading stories from sources you've never heard of, where there's no telling who owns it or what agenda they might have. And I also love their blind spot feature, which shows you stories that are underreported by either side of the political spectrum. And it helps explain why we often talk past each other and why some people seem to hyper-focus on what seems like nonsense, often because some random blog post went viral among certain people. Now, all this is why Ground News is my favorite way to get the news. And as a legal eaglet, you can save 40% off of the Ground News Vantage subscription by clicking on the link that's on screen or down below. This subscription gives you unlimited access to every feature, including the Bias Insight tool and blind spot feed. And by subscribing, you'll support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. So to get a 40% off discount, click on the link below. And after that, click on this link over here for more Legal Eagle, or I'll see you in court.